As most kids do, I grew up watching cartoons. I was fortunate enough to witness firsthand the Disney Renaissance and the emergence of Pixar as a child in the 1990s, enjoying the privilege of films like Aladdin and Toy Story in their theatrical first runs. Television animation captured me with shows like Batman the Animated Series and Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. But instead of growing out of the medium as I got older, my appreciation for the art form deepened in my early adolescence with my discovery of anime. Cartoon Network's after-school Toonami block of Japanese-made animated series, as well as films like Princess Mononoke and Ninja Scroll, helped me understand the power and versatility of stories meticulously crafted frame by frame. I even went through a phase where I rejected special effects-heavy live-action films outright, citing a naive epiphany that CGI could never integrate fantastical elements into a cinematic landscape quite like animation could. In time, I overcame this short-sighted sentiment as I studied the art of cinema. But before I learned the names of industry titans such as Hayao Miyazaki or Brad Bird, little did I know that they and many notable others had their hands in one of my favorite movies growing up. Not just any movie, however, but one based on a comic strip by a man who not only changed printing and animation forever, but also invented one of the most fundamental elements of video games. So pack your bags and hop onto your flying bed. We're going to Slumberland. After an early start in editorial cartoons, Winsor McCay began his career as a featured cartoonist with the New York Herald in 1904. Writing and illustrating such strips as Little Sammy Sneeze and Dream of the Rarebit Fiend, McCay became known for his speedy yet remarkably detailed work. In each episode of Dream of the Rarebit Fiend, a new, non-recurring character would have vivid and wildly escalating dreams across the strip's panels, only to wake up in the final image, blaming the fantastic vision on what they ate just before bed. Often Welsh rarebit, a dish consisting of a cheese sauce over toasted bread. In one of these comics, McCay introduced a character named Nemo, a young boy who would go on to star in his own series starting in 1905. Much like Dream of the Rarebit Fiend, Little Nemo in Slumberland spun a weekly fantasy tale about the title character on wondrous adventures who wakes up in the final frame of each episode. The vibrant full-page comic was printed in color, so in order to ensure that his work was being reproduced correctly, McCay developed a system for the accurate aligning of ink layers to produce a full-color image. This came to be called a print registration and can still be found on everything from modern newspapers to product packaging and more. Little Nemo in Slumberland went on to become the cartoonist's most notable creation, and in 1911 provided the basis for one of the earliest animated shorts ever made, directed by McCay himself. His foray into filmmaking would see him innovate once again, this time for the nascent medium of motion pictures. As an animator, McCay developed a technique known as in-betweening, in which an artist first draws the most pivotal moments in a moving sequence, called keyframes, to then go back and connect the action with a series of in-between images. This method became standard for animators the world over, and even provides the basis for how many contemporary computer animation applications function. To say that McCay had a notable career is an understatement. And though his use of harmful ethnic stereotypes in his work is lamentable and should be part of any conversation about the man's contributions, his achievements are nonetheless impressive. Like Little Nemo, Japanese producer Yutaka Fujioka had a dream of his own to bring Winsor McCay's creation to life under the banner of his animation studio, Tokyo Movie Shinsha. Having produced animated adaptations of comics like Osamu Tezuka's Big X and Monkey Punch's Lupin III, Fujioka felt that he could do justice to the imaginative Art Nouveau world of McCay's design. So in 1977, the producer traveled all the way from Japan to California to meet personally with the descendants of the late cartoonist and obtain the rights to make the feature film version of Little Nemo. Looking to bridge the gap between his studio's resources and the talent and sensibilities of the Western film industry, Fujioka reached out to veterans such as Chuck Jones and even George Lucas to come on as co-producers. Although the two men turned down the job for different reasons, Fujioka ultimately found a partner in Star Wars producer Gary Kurtz, who in turn hired Fahrenheit 451 author Ray Bradbury to pen a screenplay. Stepping into the director's chair on the Japanese side of production, two young animators struggled with creative differences from the higher-ups. Some sources claim that one of them even referred to the endeavor as the worst experience he has ever been through. That man was allegedly Hayao Miyazaki, director of such films as My Neighbor Totoro and Spirited Away, who would step down along with Grave of the Fireflies director Isao Takahata and later go on to found the venerable Studio Ghibli. A number of directors filled the void for brief stints, including future Studio Ghibli animator Yoshifumi Kondo and Osamu Dezaki, director of The Rose of Versailles and space adventure Cobra. These efforts produced a number of test films, but none of these iterations got any further than the pilot phase. The American side of things was also experiencing a revolving door of creatives, including a young Brad Bird, who would find success with his later films The Iron Giant and The Incredibles. Gary Kurtz eventually stepped down as well, and Fujioka set about hiring a replacement producer along with a new screenwriter. Several writers produced drafts for the troubled production, including French artist Mobius, but it wasn't until Chris Columbus came along that the film found its script. Songwriting duo the Sherman Brothers, famous for their contributions to such films as Mary Poppins and Chitty Chitty Bang Bang, were brought on to write music for the picture, including the title theme performed by Oscar-nominated singer Melissa Manchester. And finally, two new directors were tapped to see the production through to completion. For the American side, William Hertz, director on a number of Jay Ward series such as George of the Jungle and The Bullwinkle Show. And for the Japanese side, Masami Hata, director of the one and only Japanese-produced animation based on Super Mario Bros. On July 15, 1989, over a decade after Yutaka Fujioka's initial trip to California, the simply titled Nemo was released in Japanese cinemas. In the film, the titular Nemo is whisked away to a fantasy world called Slumberland, where he is told that he has been chosen as the successor to King Morpheus, who gives him a key that can open every door in the kingdom. But first, a warning: to never open the door bearing the sign of the dragon. The king's daughter, Princess Camille, shows Nemo around Slumberland, where he meets a cigar-smoking clown named Flip. Misadventures with the mischievous Punchinello lead Nemo right to the door that Morpheus warned him about, where he unwittingly unleashes the Nightmare King upon Slumberland. Returning to the castle for his coronation, Nemo receives his royal scepter, which is the only weapon capable of defeating the Nightmare King. During the festivities, King Morpheus is kidnapped by the evil monster. Nemo then sets off with Flip, Camille, and others to Nightmare Land, where he destroys the dark villain, rescuing Morpheus and saving Slumberland. The film ends with Nemo waking up in his own bed, much like the final panel of McKay's comic strips. Nemo failed to perform at the box office and faced intense competition when another animated film hit theaters just 2 weeks later. And what movie might that be? KIKI'S Delivery Service, directed by Hayao Miyazaki, who had left the Little Nemo project years earlier before the founding of his own studio. Nemo saw a return of less than 1/3 of its production budget, a massive flop for TMS and distributor Toho. 3 years later, on August 21, 1992, the English-language version of the film titled Little Nemo Adventures in Slumberland saw a small North American release in less than 600 theaters, not nearly enough to attempt any meaningful financial recuperation. On home video, however, the VHS release became the #4 best-selling children's title of 1993, selling 1.5 million copies. I find the film to be one of the most impressive examples of how Eastern and Western animation sensibilities can come together to make something wholly unique. Despite leaving the project early on, Miyazaki's influence is impossible to ignore, particularly in the flying sequences. The character designs fall squarely between the aesthetics of Disney and Studio Ghibli, and the early 20th century European cityscapes evoke an Art Nouveau style comparable to KIKI'S Delivery Service and Miyazaki's 2004 film Howl's Moving Castle. The English-language cast features fun performances by comedian Mickey Rooney and René Auberjonois of Star Trek Deep Space Nine fame, but I feel that special recognition is deserved to young actor Gabriel Damon, who must carry the film as the eponymous Nemo and does a fantastic job. Narratively, Little Nemo is a little messy, likely due to the number of hands that touch the project over the years. But I can't help but admire it, in part for how it reminds me of two of my favorite other stories, Where the Wild Things Are and The Wizard of Oz. As a showcase for animation and art direction, however, it stands up to the very best of the era. Little was done in the area of merchandising to capitalize on Little Nemo's US arrival. But in Japan, Capcom developed 2 games based on the film, one for arcades titled Nemo, just like the movie, and one for the Nintendo Famicom called Pajama Hero Nemo. The arcade version is notable for being directed by Yoshiki Okamoto, a producer on games such as Final Fight and Street Fighter II, with a score by renowned composer Yoko Shimamura of Kingdom Hearts fame. The Famicom version has its own pedigree of talent behind it, with Tatsuya Minami taking the helm as director some years before tackling producing duties on the Resident Evil and Devil May Cry series. Tokuro Fujiwara produced the tie-in, having worked on such titles as Mega Man and Bionic Commando. While in Japan the game came out in December of 1990, a little more than a year after the film, it was actually released in America 2 months before that, almost 2 whole years before the movie hit US shores. So let's take a look at the retitled NES version of Pajama Hero Nemo. This is Little Nemo, the Dream Master. In Little Nemo the Dream Master, the player naturally takes control of the eponymous Nemo through a series of 2D platforming levels filled with ground-based, water-bound, and aerial enemies. Although the pajama-clad hero carries the magic scepter on his back, the player's only means of defense is by throwing candies, which will temporarily stun monsters. Worry not though, as Nemo will soon come upon the frog, the first of several allies that will aid him through this adventure. Feeding candy to the amphibian will allow the player to take on the abilities of the creature. In the frog's case, higher jumping, faster swimming, and the capability of defeating enemies by hopping onto them. This mechanic feels very similar to later NES games like Kirby's Adventure and Little Samson. The frog is one of 8 animal friends that will help Nemo on his journey. The mole is useful for burrowing and traversing underground areas, although it cannot jump or attack. The lizard has no offenses either, but can run fast, climb vertical surfaces, and fit through narrow spaces. The gorilla can also climb, as well as punch enemies. The hornet's offenses are invaluable as the only creature with a ranged attack and, naturally, the ability to fly. The hermit crab allows the player to dig through underwater sand, similar to the mole, although its pincers give it an advantage against enemies. The flounder is the fastest swimmer in the game, but has no means of defense. And finally, there's the mouse, a climbing creature like the lizard and gorilla, but armed with a mallet that can attack monsters and destroy certain walls to open up new paths. Despite the fact that Nemo's animal friends are the most essential component of gameplay, they have no basis in the source material. Most stages begin with a brief dialogue with a character from the film who gives the player a hint about the level. Although there are a few purely linear stages, most areas encourage exploration to find a number of keys required to open the exit door, likely a nod to the dragon key gifted to Nemo in the movie. In practice, this feels a bit like hunting for bones in A Nightmare on Elm Street for NES. After 7 levels of exploration and key finding, Nemo will finally meet Princess Camille, who explains that, just like in the film, King Morpheus has been kidnapped and must be rescued from Nightmare Land. She tells Nemo about the power held in his royal scepter, unlocking the ability to charge and shoot projectiles at enemies. The 8th and final stage is broken up into 3 relatively brief sections, all ending with a boss encounter. The first of these, King Penguin, who I don't believe has any basis in the movie, rains down harmful bubbles upon the player character while launching a ground attack with baby penguins. However, the second boss, a manta ray, is featured prominently in the film's climactic battle. In the game, it dives across the screen, firing pillars of flame against our hero. Finally, after another brief level with some excellent environmental buildup, Nemo meets the evil Nightmare King. This last boss will try to take down the young boy with a series of laser blasts and a roaming red blob that can be dispatched with a scepter shot. Upon defeating the dark entity, King Morpheus is rescued. Princess Camille thanks Nemo with a kiss, and he wakes up in his bed, just like in the movie. The gameplay is smooth and responsive, with mostly accurate hit detection. The only weirdness I encountered was in trying to break walls with the mouse's mallet. This can be frustrating while simultaneously avoiding enemies. The various animal allies allow for a constantly changing playstyle, which keeps the action fresh and interesting. The colorful and wonderfully varied environments are based on locations from the movie, such as King Morpheus's train room, the upside-down corridor, Nemo's bedroom, and more. A couple of aforementioned linear levels, including a train riding segment and a vertically scrolling stage, break up the exploration-based gameplay that dominates the majority of the experience. The sprite work is also quite cute and has a sort of Mega Man aesthetic to it. Junko Tamiya's music is playful and catchy, but fails to capture the same tone of the sweeping film score by the London Symphony Orchestra. Ultimately, my biggest complaint about the game is the difficulty, which is downright brutal. Enemies act with a variety of movement patterns that one must contend with during otherwise fun platforming challenges, making for an experience that is often more frustrating than enjoyable. But Capcom's expertise in design shines through despite this. As new generations discover the marvelous work of Walt Disney and Studio Ghibli, I hope that Winsor McCay's place in the history of the art form is not forgotten. Though Little Nemo Adventures in Slumberland has received updated releases on DVD and Blu-ray, it feels like its legacy is overshadowed by the giants of American and Japanese animation. Even Little Nemo, the Dream Master, feels somewhat lost in the annals of classic gaming history, despite a strong pedigree of talent and a still prolific developer. And lest we forget McCay's innovation in comics printing and animation, keep in mind that his influence extends to not just Little Nemo for NES, but in fact, all video games. He's actually responsible for an animation process called cycling, in which a sequence of movement is drawn to be looped and extended indefinitely, useful for actions such as walking and running. This concept is fundamental to the vast majority of all video games, and has been since the earliest games were produced. That's right, we can thank a man who lived through the turn of the 20th century for run cycles. He didn't have a major studio or the technological advancements that animators and game designers enjoy today, but like Little Nemo, he had a dream. And sometimes, that's all you need.